Okay, so we'll get started with Nick Whiteman. He's a marine geologist working for the Maine Geological Survey, and he's been there a year, this week, I guess, so it's a celebration. And he got here just before the storm season arrived in full force. He has classical geology training from Tufts University and specialized in near-shore environments and their dynamics at the University of Maine. He got his master's degree there working on a NOAA project of special merit with a focus on field methods to study coastal bluff erosion and landslide hazards. So I think he probably knows a thing or two that we want to know. Especially noting the seasonal effects that condition these environments. And when he's not storm chasing or beach mapping for the Geological Survey, he's working on his PhD, and he's eager to apply hydrodynamics research to Maine's coast and public health and safety. So Nick, take it away.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, thank you again, Irene, for the introduction. Good evening, everybody.
Move just a little bit center. There you go.
Center of the camera?
Yeah,
All
that's
right.
good. Thank you.
So I have the challenge of going first, and it is a very complex set of environments, complex set of processes. It's tough to pack it all into 10, 15 minutes. So I'll try to keep things sort of light and general in the presentation sense and save a lot for conversation. I'm happy to dig into any of these topics. But just for the audience, at least first, we want to ask kind of what defines a shoreline. What might we all consider stable can be very different, and there's no wrong answer to that. What are your goals for shoreline stability? And I was asked to comment on some longevity and effectiveness. So things, food for thought for you all. It's helpful for us to learn some of your feelings on these questions. But I chose this photo as well because we have a landslide deposit. That tree did not grow there. It rode its way down into the intertidal, and the sediment from that has supported the marsh around here in this environment. So about 48% of the Maine's coast is comprised of unconsolidated sediments left behind by the glaciers and cut back into the bluffs, which about 1/3 of the bluffs are actively eroding. Leads to the bluff erosion cycle. Many of you have maybe seen a version of this, but really, so this is how bluffs end up protecting themselves. They wouldn't exist without erosion, and they're not rebuilt by wind and waves. Of a process where you will slump, it'll change the near shore, the shallow environment, it'll lift it up and be ideal real estate for salt marsh to colonize, and eventually it'll erode and repeat as it protects itself and then fails again. It provides the sediment that sustains these habitats and other protected habitats as well. But coastal bluffs themselves are not a protected resource in the state of Maine. This sediment transfer from bluffs to the intertidal sustains a lot of these protected resources. Mudflats, sand beaches, dunes, coastal wetlands, shellfish flats, they're among some of the ones that are sustained by this process. And without them, we would not have many of these features along the Maine coastline. There's a challenge to this, I'll go back for a second. This is a two-dimensional concept of what we know is a pretty broad world. And so this eroding sediment does not just disappear, but ends up distributed nearby. And so we talk about sediment transport. Here we actually have a bluff down in Freeport that is undergoing several different phases of that bluff erosion cycle in different places laterally along the beach. We've got marsh out front protecting the slope, we've got eroding bluffs, and this beautiful sediment plume distributed into the mudflat. Contributions from these bluffs are distributed and support these environments. I've run that, I'm hammering that home. Waves and tidal currents act primarily as clearing agents of already eroded and vulnerable materials. It reaches the intertidal, it gets digested and spread around. Water will distribute the sediment, and water also governs the habitats that can exist in this given location. You want to consider the varied presence of upland, high tide, low tide, and subtidal species. It's a very sensitive, depth sensitive, and time sensitive environment. And bluff erosion, again, and the sediment supplies is integral to these environments. Sea level really defines the shoreline. It's probably not hard to see where high tide spends most of its time at this one particular site. I can get into this process as well. It's quarrying as it dries out. Shoreline stability becomes a challenge when sea level is unstable, and that bluff erosion cycle perpetuates as the sea level rises. From regulatory purposes, we use both the highest annual tide and in some cases the highest astronomical tide. Yes, they have the same acronym, to help try and gauge a place where we'll define setbacks and limitations in activities. Traditionally, a lot of stabilization efforts have been placed landward of these lines to avoid the resource. But we know now and we understand that this connection from land to sea is actually quite important, and interrupting that connection can have negative impacts over time. So that leads us to this idea that any real hold-the-line strategy, if it's gray or if it's green, will face deeper water over time, and that leads to coastal conversion, and we call that coastal squeeze, where some environments can be pinched out as water raises up against something that's in opposition. And a bluff can naturally be in opposition to raising water. So we'll consider some strategies, and I don't have a lot of in-depth particular case-by-case strategies here today. That's what some of our other experts are talking about, and that's what we also work to help share information on a case-by-case basis, but they all require some accommodation space. The other thing to remember is that contiguous projects are more successful than individual efforts. We've seen this up and down the coast, and so working with your neighbors, working with your community, not just having something end abruptly after 100 feet. You want to consider a strategy that blurs the line. You want to really, rather than have a thin shoreline, you want to work with the environment and the habitats to slow water down, to increase surface area and complexity, and sustain a habitat that might also reside and move with the rising shoreline. So slow water down, manage your upland inputs as well. We'll take a whole other slide to talk about groundwater, another slideshow, and foster an adaptive environment. These are some strategies to consider. I also want to maintain that you maintain a strong upland connection. Here, there was an invisible fence, and that's not what caused this break, but it's perforated, and it's a good example of how shallow some of the roots are in something like a lawn. Only 2 inches really doesn't do a lot to bind your bluff face to your bluff top. So just an interesting example from Brunswick. We will always recommend grading back steep slopes and trying to alleviate some of that overburden. It also helps with the groundwater pressure. And we'll always recommend planting a vegetative buffer. You want to take advantage of shrubs and trees and roots that will help hold these sediments in place because they are unconsolidated. There is nothing that is gluing them together. They're just left behind by the glaciers, and they're very sensitive to water. And always consider that in many ways, a hazard is defined by how close you are to it. So if you have room to work with, consider that as well. And so we can get into a little stability first aid. Oftentimes you'll see something where you've had an eroded scarp, and any of you who garden know that soils can bake hot in the sun, and then they're inhospitable. Before you rush to do a large project here, there are some things you can do on a small permit by rule basis, small sort of gardening problem basis, where you can treat some of this and foster a healthy environment without having to go too far into it. Stability isn't just about a steep slope, it's about reducing environmental stress. And so managing fluctuations like wet, dry, hot, cold, freeze, thaw can stop some of these sediments from just freely weathering out. And make a big difference in healing your bluff and kind of slowing the process that people are working to maintain. Vegetation covers excels at this, protects physically from rain. The roots help bind sediments as well. And some MGS tools and resources. There aren't links here, but if you go to our page, you can find any one of these things. I'm also happy to follow up with a link tree for some of these things, but in any of your process, any of your permitting process, you will likely have to use these tools. So bluff stability mapping, some of it isn't as up to date as we would like it to be. If you feel that your bluff stability map needs updating, please contact us. We're working to keep these things, but there's only so many of us. And there's resources online about how to use some of these tools as well, what it means to have green, yellow, and red from stable towards unstable. The bluff stability maps also include adjacent habitats, whether it's mudflat or ledge, or things to consider for your projects, what might be appropriate. Sand dune maps, it'll be important to check to see if you're in a sand dune before some of these, because the regulations will change. And some of these things are as they exist, not necessarily as mapped. We have a coastal property owner's guide. It is very in-depth, so you'll want to check that out for different best management practices or contact us to help navigate it. FEMA flood zone maps are important in your application and understanding some of the expectations for where water might reach. And we also have our sea level ticker, something you can, these are just some of the many resources we have. When we review, DEP asks us to review and comment on all coastal zone projects. This is not a comprehensive list, but the things we consider. We consider the geologic character of the site. We look at the evident symptoms of erosion, as well as the site's history. We try to parse out, was this a storm impact? Is it a chronic problem? Is it a land use problem? Is it groundwater? Is it wave action? There's often many different factors. Every case is different. We consider the transport that is on display. We look at drift along the shore and how that might impact indirect and direct areas. And we try to consider alternate strategies that are proposed, all applications require a consideration of alternate strategies and how they align with best management practices of shorelines that are very dynamic. There is one key sort of Maine National Resource Protection Act standard that helps protect bluff areas. Again, bluffs themselves are not directly protected, but it's about soil erosion. And then activity will not cause unreasonable erosion of soil or sediment, but also not unreasonably inhibit the natural transfer from the land to the marine environment. But this does pose problems of sort of what is considered unreasonable for one property or a whole cove. Cumulative impacts are something we are concerned about, and I'll share a few of these in a moment. How does a community assess the value of different adjacent habitats in terms of its importance? And that can be very different from place to place, from case to case. Often smaller pocket coves are more sensitive to the very limited source of material that they have versus a larger system that may be able to endure more modification. And so I mentioned cumulative impacts and trying not to, say, sever the connection between the land and the sea. And so this is something we have been seeing, and I'm not here to be entirely anti-wall, but there's a way to work with these systems. When you armor bluff, even within consistent regulations, it can end up severing that connection and have an indirect impact on some of these habitats and resulting in coastal squeeze. And so cumulative impact is something we are trying to learn more about and trying to assess the past 10, 15, 20 years throughout the coast of Maine. There's a story here. This wall was put in to protect a road. End effect erosion triggered a landslide that supported a marsh. It left a scarp, brought in another wall. At the time this second wall went in 2016, it looked like a solid design. Flatter, braided back, there's a French drain behind it. I mean, you see these problems tend to move along. We'll take a look at the corner of this as well. What does it look like in 2024? We are starting to see more deep water species taking over where there was a marsh. The end has started to fail, and the geotech actually didn't allow a vegetative planting. This design had a tapered consideration to actually take root, and there's pea stone gravel now where the marsh would like to be. So there's things to consider. We don't want a project that just ends abruptly. It tends to end at a property line or something, and nature will taper it for you. This is January 2024 and June 2024. And so you can see there's a very sharp contrast between the size of this material and the clays behind it. And without anything working to enhance this project, root it in place and help sustain and slow water through the void space or to hold the stones, you can see there are consequences that may not be part of the plan. We've also seen that the erosion can continue behind some of these installations, and it limits what actually can then connect to the beach. And this one's a dramatic example. It's from the map of the Kennebec, but the drainage pipe is sitting right here, and the project has moved on. And again, there are ways to incorporate stone as ballast, protection against ice, working as a tow support, but there are projects that are not contiguous and can be bypassed as well. And notably, I don't have a lot of living shoreline examples up here for you. There are documented failures, there are documented successes, but they're very case-specific projects, and so it would take a whole presentation for each case. But when you want to work with something, I wouldn't fault anyone for seeing this bluff and wanting to protect the tow or to manage this after a storm. I also wouldn't fault anyone for thinking that this came after that. But this is actually 2017, and this is 2023. There's time to this. Erosion can look like erosion when you visit, but if you haven't been watching it over time, you might not see how these systems adjust, and you can help us with this. We have spatial resolution down. We can come out with a GPS. We can come out with a laser scanner, but we don't have our day-to-day, our month-to-month changes in some of these contexts. They will self-heal in a lot of cases. They will sustain environments, and sometimes it can look a bit more. And I won't cheat anybody, this is actually 2024. So it did take a hit, but the slope is actually quite reposed. The marsh roots are still here. These trees are just starting to go, but they've been around since 2017 at least. So there's something you want to tie into. And I think a part of that takeaway is that, before I get into those conclusions, there are things you can do to work with from first aid process. There's some things you can do with your natural systems before, especially maybe you're considering a project and it's going to take a year to permit it. You might be able to get ahead of some of that effort and some of that expense and try to just sustain something that nature's also been working on as well. And I know that our experts will talk on the balance of these things. Just a few parting remarks before we have our conversation later. This process does provide sediments that sustains protected intertidal habitats. This is one example of this site I've been using. This is a very popular clam flat. Erosion has seasonal characteristics and significant upland influences. Contiguous and congruent projects fare better than individual efforts. Again, that end effect can be very troublesome, and working to blur that line really gets you more shoreline in some ways as well. You leverage natural systems that tend to strengthen over time. And I think that is it for now. It's a brief run out of geologic background. After that, I don't know how I did that.
You actually have a minute and 3 seconds.
I yield my time.
And I didn't say this before, 2 things I didn't say. One, there are baked goods and ice water in the back, if for no other reason than when we're done, if you want to stay and talk for a bit. The other thing is we're going to ask you to hold your questions till the 3 presentations are over, so that, as Nick just said, we'll have a conversation after that with our experts and our affected folks. Okay? Thank you, Nick.
Irene, could you move just a little bit further in? There you go, I got you.
I think we're going to ask Andrew to go next. And some of you may know Andrew McCullough. He's a civil engineer with his own firm in Ellsworth, and he's actually done a lot of projects in the Down East area. So he has a lot of experience. He's a graduate of Penn State University with a degree in civil engineering, and he's got 27 years of experience managing engineering projects in Down East Maine, from Stonington to Ellsworth, Mount Desert Island to Goldsboro. He holds a professional engineering license as well as a state of Maine site evaluator's license and something I don't know, it's a VS water system operator certification. He has also served on the state of Maine Department of Agriculture Water Management Board. So we did this in this order because Andrew's probably, I don't want to offend anybody here, but I think Andrew's probably the hands-on guy more. And he comes at it from a slightly different perspective, I believe, than either Nick or John. So that's why we thought we would break that up. So if you're ready to go, Andrew?
Hit that slide.
Do you need? Oh, shoot. Uh-oh, I just did something terrible. So, wait. Never let you touch these things. Okay. Take that away from her.
Well, I can tell you that this photo was taken before 1978. This is a photo from when I was quite young, looking at the front of my grandparents' cottage in Brooklyn. And this is where my interest in shoreline stabilization began. After the winter, after the storm in 1978, my grandparents came up in May, as a lot of people do, and said, you know what, it's all gone. And it was all gone. And so I jumped in the car with my uncle, and we came up, and so the job was to put it back together. My job was to scrounge up some of the materials to put it back together. Again, that is not me at 12. I think I was probably 9 or 10, but so I was a scrawny 12-year-old, and I wasn't going to do very much to lift these timbers back into place. But I could roam up and down the beach and roll roll them back down to the water and then take the rowboat and retrieve them and bring them back so we could use them again or use somebody else's that were gone. So in 1978, and I'll speak from my experience along this section of Shoreline, we reconstructed, this Lincoln log style wall. There were other people down the shoreline who constructed a very, and not all of you would consider it beautiful, but it was a very beautiful timber framed bulkhead in front of their house, and with all 8x8s, and it looked great. And then there were some people that just had load after load of large boulders backed up and dumped over the side. So that was a lot of what I saw. And I will say also that a lot of people just would take the debris from some of the leftover trees. You can see that kind of idea over here, and they would just stack it up against the shoreline. And I'm not sure now that that is a very effective thing for preventing damage from wave action. But it does retain some of the soil as it, and keeps some of the soil there, because you do see some high, what we call fringing salt marsh right in front of it. After I began my professional career, I started to, probably as early as 1995 or 1996, start to get some calls asking for design or asking for assistance permitting shoreline stabilization. So in the year 2000, I wrote or called the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and requested some information that I thought might help me to make wiser decisions going forward. So these are some of the coastal engineering technical notes that I received from them. Armor unit placement method, riprap revetment design, use of geotechnical fabrics, revetments, their applications and limitations. What was also interesting at the time is they sent me some of the different charts that they used in assessing or modeling wave action and calculations for modeling wave run-up. And they also provided me with charts that in a lot of instances were being utilized to establish the base flood elevations that FEMA was establishing in the 70s. And all of those charts were showing the high water along this coastline in the year 1978 as basically being considered the 100-year event. So that was interesting because I had seen at least what it did firsthand. Today, and this is a riprap shoreline stabilization project in Deer Isle. It was completed a couple years ago. Today, the Department of Environmental Protection and other state and federal agencies they want to see more of a living shoreline. And as was just very well described. The reasons for that are the sediments and what they contribute to the intertidal area. One of the documents that frankly I have been studying for about the last, and studying, restudying, trying to apply is this document that was prepared in 2015 by NOAA, Guidance for Considering the Use of Living Shorelines. Now, some of these applications that I've seen, and NOAA uses a chart that talks about whether it's a low energy environment, a higher energy environment, or an extremely high energy environment. And the alternatives that are recommended vary depending on that. But most of the sites that I get engaged to work on are high energy environments. What I consider a high energy environment is specifically a velocity zone identified by FEMA. Velocity zone indicates that there's higher or much more substantial wave action. And when you see those FEMA maps, they give you a base flood elevation. That base flood elevation could be 12. It could be, frankly, in one situation that I looked at last week out in Oceanville, it's 18. And so what we see, and it varies down the bay here as far as the elevation of the highest annual tide. Right up here, the highest annual tide elevation is elevation 7.9. As we go further down around 7.2. So near the toe of the slope of your shoreline, or maybe out a few feet from the toe of your slope, is that elevation 7-ish point. So if we're saying that the base flood elevation is 12, that means that you're seeing 5 or 6 feet high surges or wave action during those storm events, i.e. January 10th, January 13th, March 10th, December 23rd, 2022. Those were all events out of the southeast, 65, 68 mile per hour winds, high tide, and frankly, when I've shot debris lines starting January 12th or so, after my wife would let me go out and leave Ellsworth, those debris lines are almost exactly at what FEMA has listed as the flood zone elevation for that area. On some of these sites down on Newberry Neck and in Contention Cove, I don't have to tell you, but the highly erodible soils that you have here, there was 4, 6, and 8 feet of shoreline lost. And here's another picture of some of that riprap shoreline stabilization. We were able to maintain a lot of the vegetation at the top of the slope. In this situation, we actually brought in the pneumatic hammer on the excavator. Instead of pinning our riprap to the ledge, we actually hammered out a trough for it to fit into so that it didn't go anywhere. In the reading I did last weekend, I think the report I read was that the elevation, sea level has risen 8 inches since the 1950s to now. And I've seen the number 1.5 or 1.6 feet that is projected to increase by 2050. So those are some of the numbers that we're looking at. Again, I wasn't measuring the debris lines with my GPS, with my total station, with any of those things at age 12. I was looking around and saying, oh, there it is. I can tell you that I've been to some of those properties that I was at when I was 12 years old, and I have measured them. And again, that debris line and the damage is almost identical to that time. And I know that starts to date me, which isn't necessarily good. So what can you do? And again, this was touched on a little bit. So if you have shoreline stabilization, if you have something in place, whether it's structural or non-structural, you can repair it without a permit from the DEP if you're doing less than 50%. If you're fixing less than 50% of it, you typically should contact your code enforcement officer, let them know that you're going to be down there, and you can go in and repair that back to its original condition without a permit. If you are doing greater than 50% repair, a permit by rule is required. Because you are adjacent to what is also termed the coastal wetland, the intertidal area, you also need approval of timing from Department of Marine Resources and DIF&W. Town permits, it's going to depend on the town whether they require a permit or not for repairs greater than 50%. The one thing that for people that is nice is the DEP is under obligation to make a decision on a permit by rule within 15 days. So if you wait and you haven't received anything within 15 days, that still means that they're not questioning it, and so you can go ahead. Sometimes I get them back 20, 25, 30 days later, and fortunately they say, yes, they're approved, but that is their obligation under a permit by rule. If you are replacing your current stabilization with a different kind or installing new stabilization, you must apply for and receive a full permit, or what's termed a Tier 3 permit. The review time by the DEP, once submitted, is 4 months. You most likely will need to apply for a shoreline zoning permit from the town and a flood zone permit because you're in the flood zone. If you construct any portion of your project in the intertidal zone, so below that highest annual tide line, then the Corps of Engineers also has to weigh in and issue a permit for that. Now, there are situations where a structure is 20 feet away from the shore, and in order to create a stable slope, which we talk about an angle and not a vertical slope, we have to taper that out so that we are into the intertidal zone. It's not something I really choose to do very often if I can avoid it, but it does happen. So again, in that situation, the Corps of Engineers also has to weigh in. If you wish to plant vegetation to create a living shoreline, you typically only need to apply for a permit by rule. again, the timing of approval would be required. And one thing we were talking about when we talk about that is it's important to plan your planting so that you're doing it at a time that it can get established. And you work, whether it's watering it, whether it's something else, to take care of that while it gets established. So when we assess a site, what do we look for? Again, we look for where the HAT is, the highest annual tide elevation. That's the limit of the coastal wetland. The elevation is given to us by the Maine Geological Survey. In order to determine where that is, we have to utilize a GPS unit that's centimeter accurate so that we know that we're getting an elevation of 7.1 or 7.2 or 6.9. We know exactly where that line is. Is it an unstable coastal bluff, as defined by the Maine Geological Survey? What is the FEMA flood zone elevation or classification and the base flood elevation? Again, some of the other factors. Is the groundwater a contributing problem? Because that soil is weaker when it's wet. If we can get at least some of that groundwater intercepted and drained away, the vegetation is going to have a better chance, and that soil is going to have a stronger structure. It may not have the structure needed to withstand wave action, but it is going to have a stronger structure. Again, and at the bottom of the toe, is it blue clay that has a very soft, very weak, low bearing capacity? Because over time, we add these tons of material to that slope, and if that toe is weak, it's going to settle. So then we're either going to be back there putting more material on, or we're going to have a problem. This is not necessarily a one-stop shop. Sometimes a wetland scientist may be required to review the access or assess the intertidal zone. Sometimes we may contact a landscape architect to provide some input on suitable plantings. If there's a question of where boundary lines are, we may need to contact a professional land surveyor and engage them to complete a field survey. We may, again, talking about bearing capacity, we may need a geotechnical engineer. And then the civil engineer is going to do their best, hopefully, to assess all of that information, process that information, and make decisions that are the best for the long term of the site, and come up with a solution. What you need to proceed. For the Maine DEP, you need a plan that shows the site features, the topography, the access to the site. We prepare sections, we prepare construction details, construction notes. Again, the goal is to create a picture of the project and provide the contractor with the information he needs in order to build it. Time to review, we've talked about. The time between someone contacting me and completing the plans and permit applications is a function of the workload. At times when somebody contacts me and I say, okay, next week. Sometimes now I say next year. The cost can begin at probably around $9,000. Application fees typically are $1,000, and it goes up from there. Benefits and concerns, we could talk about them a little bit more later. Short answer is you may need a revegetation plan for areas disturbed within 75 feet of the shoreline. The objective is to avoid and minimize removal of existing vegetation to complete the project. In many instances, it may be possible to complete a lot of the work with equipment down on the beach, provided that you aren't destroying or damaging fringing salt marshes or other vegetation there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, that was terrific information. I'm sure that was helpful. We have one more speaker, and that's John McLean, who has, I think, the longest title I've ever seen in my life. He's Maine DEP.
It's not even all of it either. There's more.
Maine DEP Non-Point Source Training Center Coordinator.
And manager of the Stream Crossing Grants Program out the Our Shore.
And I think the length of the title equates to the amount of value he brings.
Yeah, I definitely is waiting for that.
He earned a degree in wildlife ecology from the University of Maine in 2004, and he has since that time provided guidance to individuals working and living near protected resources, which is probably all of us. He began his career in fisheries restoration and went to DEP's Field Services and Enforcement Unit, designing and overseeing hundreds of construction projects in and near water resources as Southern Maine Environmental Coordinator for Maine DOT, as a DEP watershed specialist and a habitat biologist for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And most recently, and I think this is going to be important for all of us, he's done a lot of work in terms of training the contractors that we all need to use if we're going to be doing restoration of our shorelines. Awesome.
Thank you. It's great to see everybody here. Thanks for having us. I will say right off, I apologize if I go over because I usually teach contractors. I have this like full day, 8-hour course that they go through and I speak the entire day. So I'm already really worrying that 15 minutes is up. So I'm going to kind of go through some background. Luckily, Andrew talked about a bunch of the regulatory pieces so I can kind of add and not have to go into the super basics on some of those things. So most of my work is these days teaching contractors and helping them understand how to do these projects appropriately, working with code officers, and I run the certification program for contractors working on shorelines. So anyone who's hiring somebody to do shoreline stabilization or really any work within a shoreline zone, there's a requirement to have somebody certified on site, and so that's the program that I train those folks so they know the appropriate tools, at least, that we're supposed to be using to prevent mostly soil erosion problems coming from the upland into the resource, which can contribute nutrients and other issues. So on this side of things, as you already know, this is a very complex topic, right? And every site is different. Every bit, even within a site, there's parts that are going to react differently, different soils, different slopes, different wave energy, fetch, directions. And so my angle with a lot of this stuff is the how, and I'm very interested in like why stuff works. So I always try and parse out like what does this part of the design do? What is the role it's playing? And so I don't these days do a lot. I don't do permitting anymore, but I have done it enough for a long time, and I work with those folks, so I'll hopefully be able to answer the majority of permitting questions that you might have. But if it's really site specific, or can you come, the question is, can you come to my site? The answer is probably not, but I can get you in touch with the people who can, who actually do write the permits and actually can make those kind of decisions on that, on site specific stuff. So what we see with just shoreline stabilization as this broad topic is that it's really a combination of a lot of factors. It's very obvious to us when we see when we have a storm, we have a lot of wave action, but not every wave the same size causes the same amount of damage or the same amount of erosion, or even sometimes any erosion. It really depends on the site itself and a bunch of other factors. So, but it's not always the resource as well. Andrew's mentioned groundwater can be one of those contributors. It may not be the thing that's causing the problem, but it's certainly contributing and making it harder, or making it easier for the wave action to actually start moving soils around. One thing that's overlooked almost across the board is sort of looking at ourselves. How do we use the property, and what are we doing to the property that might be contributing to this? And one of the easy ones for me is, just lawns directly to the top of the bank. As Nick was saying, there's not a lot of grab going on when that water sort of takes the plunge from the upland. The other thing is pathways. Often just because of the way we use pathways to resources, they become depressed by walking on them, which becomes a channel for water to flow. And that can be an area where it's just an added stress to that bank. It may not be the primary culprit, but it's going to make it worse than the single source of potentially wave action alone. When we talk about what kind of options we have for stabilization, one of the things that I've been working on pretty heavily with a lot of partners in the state, out of the state, contractors, a whole bunch of different folks, is adding to really the toolbox that we have, which if you go back, a lot of times we just think about riprap, right? That's the toolbox. Now we definitely have opened it up, and it was really great hearing some of the, the story with the timber crib wall, because one of the things, there are some of those sort of more old school techniques that are re-emerging with like a new kind of, maybe some different ways of vegetating and things like that. But I've been seeing a lot more sort of crib walls and stuff coming up that are, able to provide some habitat value in really tricky situations. So that's kind of a caveat with some of them. But when we talk about tools, there are tools that we can use to deal with the land use and overland water sources to minimize those impacts. There's things we can do to the slope itself. There's mention of cutting back slopes to keep the overburden of all that weight. That's one slope modification that can be done to change the erosion amounts or how much impact or soil can move. But also just the coverings of that soil from different types of vegetation. Even thinking about riprap as a covering of soil, it's something to break up energy. Or adding roughness or different features to the land so water can't take a straight path back down when it comes up on the bank and washes back down into the water. It often channelizes, that can bring some additional energy to those areas. So that's another thing that we use. Toe protection is a big deal because that's where most of the erosion is occurring on a lot of sites. You lose some of that toe, and that's the support. That's your foundation of the bank. And if you don't have that support, then that can lead to sort of mass erosion of soils, or sliding, or even lead to potential rotational failure risk of slopes as the whole thing kind of moves and rotates. So things like even just a toe stone sometimes, not with the rest of the riprap design. If you're just dealing with a toe erosion, sometimes you can just deal with that. So a lot of what DEP's role in education on this stuff is trying to minimize what you actually need. We don't want to mess up more or disturb more of the shoreline than is actually necessary. So part of it is looking at where is it coming from? What are the things causing it? And how can we sort of put a stop sign for that process? There's other techniques too that are happening. They've happened inland for a while. There's been examples of it, and it has been starting to come into some of the coastal designs. But just dissipation of energy, we've seen some folks that have done even like adding fringe marshes or sills with marsh vegetation beyond the toe to break up energy before it actually hits it. In things like rivers, they've been using root wads for years, where it actually sticks out into the flow to break up and slow down the water energy, so the highest level of energy is not up against the bank, it's a little bit further out. If you look at, just looking at natural features like barrier islands, that's sort of one of the things that those do, sort of breaking up some of that energy, and there's generally behind it less erosion. But there's a lot of tools that we would use depending on where and what's being, what we're seeing for causes. Now, everyone thinks about wave action, but this is the issue. If we think about the problem at a small scale, a single raindrop hitting bare soil, that could be spray, it could be anything like that. Water has power to it, it's able to move things around, it's able to move soil, and there's an immense amount of erosion going on in that, very zoomed in picture of that glittery stuff that's supposed to be soil there. But there's splash from the impact of it. it's actually in the water there. That water moving now is going to transport that soil. So looking at that, and you can sort of see where all the thought process of people in the past comes into play. It's like, all right, well, this is the issue. We've got a mass of water with energy to it. It's acting on the soil. It's picking up detaching particles, moving them. Well, if that soil particle was bigger, it may not move as many of them because it needs more force to move that. So you need, higher energy to move those particles. So one of the responses is, well, what if the particles are bigger and so big that the wave can't move them? And that's sort of, in my sort of mind, how we end up with riprap. It's like, these particles are so big and so heavy that this massive amount of energy of water can't move it. Still though, I sort of up here in the corner here, looking at different sediment sizes, they still move, right? There's still an energy level at which a particle of really any size will move if it's not anchored in some other way. So we always think about the wave action, oh, it's a lot of energy on the bank there, but if we sort of shrink it down to what's actually happening, sometimes it's dealing with that small scale, which can give us some really good results. And so clearly, there's lots of examples of riprap out there. That's been the way. They're just large particles that amount of energy of water can't necessarily move. And the way that riprap projects are designed, it's to do certain things. So it's not just, although a lot of people have seen it, just like you dumping the rock over the bank, right? That's not what riprap is. Riprap is a designed structure with different parts of that structure that do different roles. Because I talk to contractors, they very much understand in a lot of ways, whoa, what's supposed to be done here, and the grade is supposed to be like this, and the rock needs to be of this size for the toe and this size for the bank. Well, if I break that down as what are those things doing? Well, we're doing a few different roles. We're protecting the toe and preventing that stuff from moving and giving it a foundation. If the slope is oversteepened or it's too steep and you have a lot of weight over it, we cut the bank back, and that's in riprap, generally cut the bank back to give it the same slope, a similar slope. We're dealing with groundwater and drainage typically, or saturation of the soils behind the riprap. Usually these days using filter fabrics or geotextiles. The role of a geotextile is to allow water to migrate from one side to the other without bringing soil with it. So saturation from flooding, high water, the water gets behind that into the soil, and as it goes back down, it needs to be able to drain back out. If you don't have something filtering that, it's going to bring fine sediments with it, and you'll have your collapse from behind kind of situation, where you can wash out behind it, or you can trap pressure, water pressure behind that material, and that can kind of push and freeze thaw stuff can really mess with it. Another aspect of riprap is then covering the soil with an erosion control. The erosion control in that case just happens to be rock. So our choices of like what are the things it's doing, we have our toe protection, and in riprap we dig a trench and we put big rocks in there. And then we grade our slope to the right angle that rock is going to sit. There's a sort of concept called angle of repose, the angle at which that particle size will sit without rolling. And that usually is what, we're cutting the banks back to a 1-to-1 to try and keep that stuff from moving very easily. We put our filter layer down, usually geotextiles, and then we put more rocks as our erosion control. So they're doing 4 different jobs, but it seems like it's just a bunch of rock. Now, I use that as a way to say, well, there's different things potentially that we could do to accomplish those same jobs. And sometimes it's going to be rock, sometimes it may not be, sometimes the answer might be toe protection and then everything else doesn't get touched. So it doesn't have to be a huge project. If the only erosion is at the toe and you don't have erosion up the bank, then sometimes you might not need to actually disturb or cause more damage in actually trying to fix it. So this is essentially the very generic diagram that DEP uses for riprap slope stabilizations. And so you can see all those sort of roles there where we have a drainage layer on our graded slope. This one's actually showing a sand bedding with a geotextile, but there are alternatives, and I really love, you're kind of joking about old school, and we're kind of going back to a lot of these things that we used to do a long time ago, and somebody was like, oh no, I got a better thing. You know, and one of the things that I'm promoting it, so maybe that's why, but I get worried about overuse of plastics, and there have been some studies showing Frenchman Bay has got some, you know, Maine did some studies that show a lot of microplastics, and a lot of the fibers that they were finding matched the color and the chemical of geotextile fabric. And that worries me, I'm like, what are we doing? But that made me also think, we didn't have this stuff forever. We've been doing riprap for centuries, or some version of that. And we've only had this plastic fabric since the 80s, really. What did we do before that? And the answer, there's gradations of gravel you can use to serve a filter layer roll. And it really depends on the riprap size you're using and the gradation of the soil behind it. So there is a bit of engineering calculation that needs to go into finding out the best filter gravel gradations. But there are options for certain sites, including layering of gradations of rock, getting down to smaller and smaller to protect that fine soil from energy. One of the nice things about that and why I promote it a bit is that it makes it a lot easier for vegetation to grow through that stone. If you place a plastic fabric underneath the stone, the roots have a really hard time getting to the soil underneath, and it never really ties the whole thing together. It really just is material sitting on top of the soil. It's never integrated together. And so we do see sometimes too with fabrics, if it's not keyed, see this diagram shows it really anchored at the top here. If it doesn't get anchored at the top, wave action and water can get up and behind it. And one of the contractors I spoke with this spring after the storms, the best description of it was the water, because it's held by the really big stones at the toe. The water got behind there and it was acting like a waterbed, bouncing the stones off of it. And so there can be a lot of pressure built up behind those things. And so that was one just installation note that is like, you gotta really, if you're using that, it's gotta be keyed behind at the top so the water can't cut behind it from surface waters. And then we have our toe anchoring there, protecting the toe, and also making sure this can't slide out, and then our erosion control surface. The problem is, so I kind of come from ecology world, done a lot of fisheries work, and there's some issues with riprap. So it does a decent job of if you have the right material and all that, it does break up some wave energy to a degree. It does act as an erosion control. It's bulky enough to hold in place against most wave energy if it's sized properly. But it really leaves a lot to be desired for the habitat of the critters and the fish and stuff here. Shorelines are really one of the most important places, locations in the state for our fish and wildlife. 80% of our terrestrial wildlife species in the state utilize the area right around the edge of resources for travel corridors and for a lot of different life stages. So it's a really important place, and they use it as like highways, essentially. There's an interesting correlation between stream crossings inland and vehicle strikes of different animals and stuff. Because they're following along and they hit the crossing and go up and over, and that's where they get hit. A lot of times deer crossings you see at those kind of places. But shorelines are the sort of highways of a lot of these areas. So when we put down a bunch of rock and we sort of take away some of that value, they don't have all of the things that those critters need anymore. So there's some things that we do notice, especially some of these were with smaller resources like streams, thermal impact, where you actually see heating of the water, which sucks oxygen out and can really affect fish populations in those streams. But then just the smothering of that habitat with something that wasn't necessarily there before provides, it makes it really hard for animals to get across it, right? If you're a little salamander and you're having to walk across it, you're gonna have a pretty hard time. Or if you're a turtle or a frog or something, a lot of these do provide a really hard place to walk. Even deer and moose have a hard time walking on that stuff. It does still deflect energy, as you saw with some of the end cut-around erosion that you see where projects stop, because those hard surfaces, some of that water is absorbed into the riprap, but some of it hits it and gets deflected, and that's where it starts to erode the next property. And we'll also see deepening of the nearshore habitat, as Nick talked about too, which can affect what organisms occur in that sort of narrow band of elevation that you'll see. Seawalls are another issue, and one of the issues with seawalls is that they deflect almost all of the energy. So that energy still has to go somewhere, and when a wave smacks into a hard wall, it either goes sideways, up, or down. And so we see a lot of scouring. One of the places you see seawalls fail is you lose your footing because it scours deep in front, or in some cases it gets behind it, like you saw in these last storms, and it's unable to escape, and it runs along the back of the wall and sort of creates its own eroded channel until it cuts down and there's no support anymore and it falls over. I don't have very much time, so I'm going to get into a couple of these other elements, because I know there's going to be some questions about permitting. The main thing that we're not changing, we're adding tools to a toolbox to try and help us minimize impact to not only the functions of the shoreline, but also the habitat elements of it, so we don't lose those things. I think everyone could imagine if the entire coast of Maine ended up being rocked, how devastating that would be to our fish and wildlife. It's not necessarily, it's always this incremental and this adding over time that makes it worse and worse. The part I want to really focus on is when we do any stabilization project, I'm not here to advocate to say do this type over that type, but when we choose what the site needs versus what I have already planned, like, oh, I'm just going to do riprap. Look at what the site actually needs. What are your soils? What are your slopes and all those things? But then in the end, no matter what kind of project it is, make sure that during it you're considering what's the habitat that, what elements am I removing from the habitat? What elements should I be putting back? And so for me as an ecologist, it's really easy for me to think about habitat in these like actual real life terms, because when I say habitat, I'm thinking about a bunch of different things, but I've found over the years it's difficult for some folks to sort of picture what do we mean by habitat. Not just, oh, that's the animal's home, but what are the things that make that habitat important. So when you're doing projects, I encourage you to think about what you're putting back as well as what the actual treatment is. So put the habitat back. And what we mean by habitat is terrestrial and aquatic shade, stuff that hangs over the ground and cools the ground down. And rock as well, heats up, so we want to eliminate some of that by shade. Creating a land or preserving land to water connection, because we need stuff that goes from the water to the land and back and forth. We need travel corridor along the shore and then from the shore to the water. That's essentially those connections there. Diversity of cover, so we don't want all the same thing. Different species need different things, and we want stuff that's low growing and higher, and it provides this a lot of beneficial elements. Our vegetation diversity, cover diversity also might be, some places are going to have exposed rock. Your shoreline has exposed rock. Those elements are really important. Logs, even just not cleaning up when stuff falls down. There are things living under that. There, could be using that for cover and other elements. Woody material is a really big deal for, woody material inputs is a really big deal for inland resources. Our inland waters are, what the biologists say, they're starved for wood, which is basically the primary production for a lot of those areas. We've, through forestry and all that, are very efficient at removing all the wood, so a lot of that stuff that would have made it into resources don't over time. So use of woody material is actually encouraged. Soil health, thinking about that, sediment transfer, Nick talked about, and sometimes specific wildlife considerations come into play depending on where you are. Oh, we're concerned about this species, we need to do something to buffer against that. Let's skip some of these. So we did come up with a method that we're going to be releasing, and this is sort of one of the first talks we've done about it, but there's this Our Shore thing that's going to hopefully help folks understand what tools are out there by minimizing the intervention and disturbance and allowing shorelines to function naturally. We'll have a checklist that goes through all the sources of erosion, height, slope, overland water, groundwater, revegetation, all the different techniques, and we're currently working on a guide that accompanies that. It's about a 100-page guide, getting into all these techniques that are outside of, it does include riprap as well. You can still arrive at riprap, but it's more that it's riprap with habitat elements added to it. Land use, one of the things is a consideration. I just love this picture because this is kind of what we're doing. When we go in, even if we do riprap shoreline, nature does not like to be unvegetated. Nature wants stuff to be growing. And one of the reasons that you see riprap not growing is either through maintenance, people just go in and cut stuff, or the geotextile inhibiting vegetation growing in. But really over time, any site that's bare rock, like we were 12,000 years ago when the glaciers left, will get vegetated, and it's this succession over time that leads us to a sort of mature forest. And my last point with this is, even if we do a project and we're here, we can often speed it up to here. So now we've cut 15 years off of the span of that. An interesting study I saw out of Massachusetts, the DOT there did some, they were looking at vegetation rates of riprap along roadsides, and they were saying it takes about 25 years for a riprap project without a geotextile to look like the surrounding untouched areas. So I guess in my mind is there's a lot of tools that we have in our toolbox to take ourselves from here, speed ourselves up 25 years, and that site will be in a better habitat, stability, and all that position than we would have otherwise. I'll just show you a couple pictures here so we can, there's just some really interesting ways of doing it. This is stone toe with live staking. This is a brush mattress. These will all grow. They're living material that's dormant. You fill some soil in there and they all root and grow out. So this will become a completely rooted mat all together. These posts are all alive too. Those are live posts that are pushed into they're probably 6 feet tall, anchored into the ground. These are all just living ways. This is a vegetated riprap, seeded vegetated riprap. This was an interesting one. This is on the Androscoggin River. This is a riprap project that I don't like to say that I was associated with the construction oversight with, but this is the edge of 2 projects, and this is the Androscoggin River here. This is coming towards you is one project, going away from you is another project. Guess which one was done first? It's a trick question. It's the rock one. So this was actually done a year earlier than that. Everything was disturbed just the same. And they only used toe riprap in this section, still graded it back, used erosion control blankets and stuff. Every bit of vegetation you see along the shoreline came in itself. None of that was seeded. Both of these sides were seeded with the same seed mix a year apart. So, point of this slide is we don't always need to go as far up with the rock. The rock is just an erosion control covering. The best erosion control coverings we have are vegetation because it actually anchors and roots in. So we can do it with both. And there are a lot of methods that are up. This is a live stake riprap project. All these are living stakes that were put in through the rock into the soil behind it, which can be done with a lot of our native shrub species. You could just cut it off a tree and stick it in the ground when it's dormant and it will turn into a new shrub. So it's a really nice, quick, anyway. This is the one here that I was talking about with the crib walls, the living crib wall using live stakes. And they used it to not have to grade this giant bank back here. And they just use it mostly as toe protection and to ease that slope at the toe where the flood zone was. But this is all vegetated and shrub. I'll stop talking so you can ask questions.
Thank you, John.